There is something that nobody tells you about comebacks. We have been culturally conditioned to imagine them as dramatic, visible, cinematic moments, the triumphant return, the public declaration, the sudden reversal of fortune that everyone around you can witness and celebrate. We picture the comeback as something that happens on a stage, under lights, with an audience present to mark the moment. And because we carry that image, we spend a great deal of time waiting for the comeback to feel like that. Waiting for the moment that announces itself with clarity and fanfare and the unmistakable sensation of turning a corner. But that is not how the empath's comeback begins. Not even close. The empath's comeback begins in the dark. It begins in a moment so quiet, so private, so utterly devoid of drama that the empath themselves may not even recognize it as the beginning of anything. It does not arrive with certainty. It does not arrive with strength. It arrives more often than not in cold middle of exhaustion so complete that the very act of continuing to fight for the relationship that has been consuming them simply becomes impossible. Not dramatically impossible. Not impossibly impossible in a way that produces a clear decision. Just quietly, finally, completely impossible in the way that a body simply stops when it has given everything it has and there is nothing left to give. And in that moment of absolute depletion, something shifts. It is subtle enough that the empath might dismiss it entirely if they are not paying attention. But it is real. It is the moment when, for the first time in what may have been months or years, the enormous river of emotional energy the empath has been pouring outward toward the narcissist, toward the relationship, toward the endless, exhausting project of trying to make something work that was structurally designed never to work begins, almost imperceptibly, to reverse direction, begins to flow back, begins to move toward the one person it should have been nourishing all along, themselves. Now, let us understand something important about why this moment tends to arrive in darkness rather than light, in exhaustion rather than clarity, in depletion rather than strength. Because this matters psychologically. The empath, by their very nature, is someone who sustains. They sustain connection, they sustain hope, they sustain effort far beyond the point where most people would have stopped. This is one of their most defining qualities, this capacity for endurance, this refusal to abandon what they have invested in, this deep and genuine belief that enough love, enough patience, enough understanding can shift almost any dynamic. The narcissistic relationship exploits this quality with devastating efficiency. Because the narcissist does not need to keep the empath engaged through genuine reciprocity, they only need to keep them engaged through intermittent reinforcement, through occasional GL. Imps of the connection the empath believes is possible through just enough warmth at just the right moments to prevent the empath's extraordinary endurance from finally reaching its limit. But here is what the narcissist fundamentally miscalculates. The empath's endurance is vast, but it is not infinite. And when it finally, genuinely runs out, something the narcissist never anticipated occurs. The empath stops, not in anger, not in a dramatic confrontation. They simply stop. And in that stopping, in that profound and total stillness, the comeback finds its first breath. This is the moment that changes everything. Not because it feels like power, it does not yet. But because it is the first moment in the entire dynamic where the empath is no longer choosing the relationship over themselves. And every comeback, every real, lasting, transformative comeback begins with exactly that choice. Once we understand that the comeback begins in that quiet, private moment of deplorable, Etchian, that still point where the empath finally stops pouring themselves in to die something that was never going to be filled, we have to address the next question. And it is a question that the empath, in the early stages of their recovery, will ask themselves with an intensity that is almost unbearable. It is the question that sits underneath the grief, underneath the confusion, underneath the anger that eventually surfaces when the numbness begins to lift. And that question is simply this: what was it all for? What was the pain for? What was the endurance for? What were all those nights of trying to make sense of something deliberately constructed to make no sense? All those mornings of rebuilding a sense of self that had been quietly dismantled the day before? All those moments of extending grace and understanding and compassion to someone who was cataloging that compassion as a map of vulnerabilities to exploit? What was any of it for? And I want to answer that question directly, without softening it into something more palatable than the truth actually is. Because the empath deserves a direct answer, not a comfortable one. The pain was the training. Not in the way that people mean when they offer that particular piece of wisdom casually, as though suffering is automatically redemptive, as though difficulty inevitably produces growth, as though the mere experience of pain is sufficient to transform a person into something stronger and wiser than they were before. That version of the idea is too easy. It lets the experience off the hook. It skips over the part where the empath has to do something very specific and very deliberate with their pain in order for it to become training rather than simply damage. What I mean when I say the pain was the training is something far more precise. Every single cycle of idealization and devaluation the empath experienced was, underneath its devastation, a masterclass in the mechanics of psychological manipulation. Every moment, full T of self-doubt that the narcissist engineered, every instance of gaslighting that made the empath question their own perception, every reframing that made them feel responsible for damage they did not cause was, in retrospect, a detailed education in exactly how sophisticated emotional manipulation operates. Every night spent trying to decode behavior that seemed inexplicable was, without the empath realizing it at the time, the development of a perceptive capacity that most people will never possess. Think about what the empath actually knows now. They know, from direct lived experience rather than theoretical understanding, how narcissistic supply works, how it is extracted, how it is maintained, how the entire dynamic is engineered to keep the supply flowing. They know what love bombing feels like from the inside, not as a concept, but as a physical, emotional, embodied experience they can now recognize in its earliest stages. They know what gaslighting does to a person's relationship with their own perception, which means they now carry an almost automatic sensitivity to any future situation where their reality is being questioned or reframed without justification. They know what the absence of genuine reciprocity feels like, not just intellectually, but in their bones, which means they will never again mistake performance for presence or charm for character. This knowledge is not theoretical. It is not borrowed from someone else's experience or extracted from a book. It is written into the empath's nervous system through direct encounter with one of the most psychologically complex relational dynamics that exists. And that kind of knowledge, embodied, earned, paid for at genuine personal cost, is the most durable kind there is. There is a concept in the study of expertise that researchers call desirable difficulty. The idea is counterintuitive but well supported that learning which involves genuine struggle, genuine resistance, genuine moments of confusion and failure produces far deeper and more lasting competence than learning that comes easily. The struggle is not an obstacle to the learning. The struggle is the mechanism of the learning. The difficulty is what makes the knowledge stick. The empath's experience of the narcissistic relationship is desirable difficulty at its most extreme. It was hard in ways that almost broke them. It was confusing in ways that undermined their most fundamental sense of reality. It was painful in ways that will take genuine time and genuine work to fully process. And it produced, in the empath who is willing to extract every lesson from it rather than simply surviving it, a quality of psychological sophistication that cannot be acquired any other way. This does not mean the narcissist did the empath a favor. Let us be completely clear about that. The narcissist was not a teacher sent to facilitate the empath's growth. They were a person operating from their own damage, their own deficits, our own deeply entrenched patterns of exploitation. The growth that emerged from the encounter was not the narcissist's gift to the empath. It was the empath's gift to themselves, extracted with enormous effort and courage from an experience that was designed to take from them rather than give. And that distinction matters. Because the empath who understands this does not feel grateful to the narcissist for the pain. They feel powerful in spite of it. They recognize that what they carry now, this hard-won, embodied, unshakable wisdom, belongs entirely to them. It was built by them in the fire of an experience that tried to consume them. The narcissist brought the fire, but the empath built something in it. And what they built is exactly what the comeback is made of, so we have established where the comeback begins in that quiet, exhausted moment of finally choosing oneself. And we have reframed the pain not as meaningless suffering, but as the most rigorous and promising training the empath will ever undergo. But now we arrive at something that is perhaps the most personally intimate dimension of the entire recovery process. Something that does not get discussed with nearly enough honesty or depth in most conversations about healing from narcissistic relationships. And that is the question of identity. Specifically, who are you now? Who are you after? Who are you when the relationship that spent months or years systematically dismantling your sense of self is finally completely behind you? Because here is what the narcissist does that is more damaging in many ways than any single act of cruelty or manipulation. More damaging than the gaslighting, more damaging than the devaluation, more damaging even than the discarding. What the narcissist does, gradually and with devastating consistency, is rewrite the empath. They do not announce this rewriting. They do not present it as an agenda. It happens in increments so small, so individually kneeable, that the empath does not notice the accumulation until they one day look in a mirror metaphorically, and sometimes literally, and encounter a version of themselves they barely recognize. The preferences they once held with confidence have been gradually replaced by the narcissist's preferences, absorbed through the constant pressure of accommodation. The instincts they once trusted that finally calibrated inner compass that told them when something was wrong, when a situation was unsafe, when a person was not who they presented themselves to be, have been systematically undermined through years of gaslighting until the empath no longer trusts the compass at all. The friendships, the interests, the ways of moving through the world that once felt entirely natural and entirely their own have been quietly eroded, subtly discouraged, or outright dismantled through the narcissist's calculated campaign to become the empath's entire world. And so the empath arrives at the beginning. NG of their comeback, not just tired and wounded, but in many cases genuinely uncertain about who they are beneath the damage. Uncertain about what they actually want, what they actually believe, what actually brings them joy when there is no one else's emotional needs to manage, no one else's reality to navigate, no one else's chaos to absorb and translate and survive. This uncertainty is one of the most disorienting aspects of early recovery, and it is one that the empath must be given permission to sit with honestly, without rushing through it, without performing a recovery that is more about appearing healed than actually healing. Because the reclamation of identity is not a single event. It is not a decision that is made once and then complete. It is a process patient, nonlinear, sometimes frustratingly slow of excavation, of going back through the layers of accommodation and adaptation and self-abandonment that accumulated over the course of the relationship and finding underneath all of it, the original self that was there before the narcissist arrived. And here is what makes this process both challenging and ultimately extraordinary. What the empath finds when they excavate deeply enough is not a damaged or diminished version of who they once were. What they find is something that the narcissist, for all their psychological sophistication, was never actually able to touch: the core, the essential self. The part of the empath that exists beneath personality and preference, and the accumulated adaptations of a lifetime, the part that feels, that connects, that perceives, that cares with a depth that is simply constitutionally irreducible. That part survived, intact, waiting. The narcissist could reshape the surface. They could influence the preferences, undermine the confidence, erode the social connections, distort the self-perception. But they could not reach the core. And the empath who understands this, who begins their recovery with the knowledge, that what is most essential about them was never actually destroyed. Only buried approaches the work of reclamation with something that begins to feel, tentatively at first, and then with increasing certainty, like hope. The practical work of this reclamation looks different for every empath. For some, it means returning to interests and passions that were quietly abandoned during the relationship, creative pursuits, physical practices, intellectual engagements that once brought genuine joy and were gradually displaced by the all-consuming demands of the narcissistic dynamic. For others, it means the slower, more interior work of rebuilding trust in their own perception, beginning to listen again to the instincts that were systematically silenced, testing them in small situations, learning to distinguish between the narcissist's voice that was internalized over years of exposure and their own authentic inner guidance. For many empaths, the reclamation of identity also involves grief. Real, legitimate grief for the version of themselves that existed before the relationship, not because that version is gone, but because the distance between who they were and who the relationship shaped them into can feel, in the early stages of recovery, almost insurmountable. This grief deserves to be honored rather than rushed. It is not weakness. It is the empath's emotional intelligence doing precisely what it is designed to do, fully processing a genuine loss before moving forward. Because you cannot build a comeback on a foundation of unprocessed grief. You can only build it on honesty, on the willingness to look clearly at what was lost, what was taken, what was surrendered, and then to make the deliberate, courageous decision to reclaim it. The narcissist spent the entire relationship telling you, in 1,000 direct and indirect ways, who you were, defining you through their projections, their criticisms, their manufactured narratives about your inadequacy and your exception, SS and your need. The comeback begins the moment you decide quietly, completely, and without requiring their permission, that you are the only one who gets to answer that question. Now we have been on a journey through this comeback, tracing it from its quiet beginning in exhaustion, through the reframing of pain as preparation, through the deeply personal work of identity reclamation. And at each stage, there has been an underlying question that the empath carries with them, sometimes consciously and sometimes not. A question that sits beneath the grief and the anger and the slow, tentative emergence of something that feels like strength. And that question is this: after everything that happened, after everything that was done to me, after everything I endured and absorbed and survived, am I still who I was? Are my gifts still intact? Did the narcissist take something from me that I cannot get back? And I want to answer that question with the directness it deserves. Not only are your gifts intact, they are deeper than they have ever been. Let us sit with that for a moment, because it runs counter to the narrative the empath often carries in the early stages of their recovery. The narrative that the relationship broke something essential in them. That the years of gaslighting and devaluation and systematic undermining of their self-trust left them diminished in ways that matter, ways that affect their capacity to feel, to connect, to perceive, to contribute the extraordinary things they have always been capable of contributing. That narrative is understandable. It is the entirely predictable psychological response to an experience that was designed at every level to make the empath feel like less than they are. But it is not accurate. And the empath's comeback depends, in significant part, on replacing that narrative with one that is. Here is what actually happened to the empath's gifts during the narcissistic relationship. The emotional intelligence did know. Diminish, it was redirected. Every unit of perceptive capacity the empath possesses was being channeled with exhausting intensity into the project of understanding and navigating and surviving the narcissist. The gift was fully operational. It was simply pointed in the wrong direction, aimed at decoding a person rather than illuminating a life. Now that it is no longer consumed by that project, it is available, all of it, in its full depth and range for everything else. The capacity for deep connection did not disappear, it went underground. The empath, in the survival mode that the narcissistic relationship eventually produces, necessarily retracted some of their natural openness. Not because the openness ceased to exist, but because the environment made openness dangerous. It was a protective adaptation, not a permanent alteration. The warmth, the authenticity, the extraordinary ability to create genuine intimacy, all of it is still present, waiting for an environment safe, enough to fully express itself again. The perceptive gifts did not weaken, they sharpened. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about what the narcissistic experience actually did to the empath's natural ability to read people, situations, and emotional dynamics. The empath entered the relationship with perceptive gifts that were already remarkable. They exit it with those gifts honed to a degree of precision that would not have been possible without the specific, extreme challenge the narcissistic dynamic presented. They have now been tested against one of the most sophisticated and deliberate systems of psychological manipulation that exists in human relationships, and they survived that test. Which means that everything below that level, every future situation, every future relationship, every future encounter with someone who is not operating with full authenticity will register with a clarity and an immediacy that is almost startling. There is a metallurgical concept that is worth understanding here. When metal is subjected to extreme heat and then carefully, deliberately cooled, something happens at the molecular level. The internal structure of the metal reorganizes. The atoms align more densely, more cohesively, more efficiently. The metal that emerges from that process is not the same metal that entered it. It is stronger, more resilient, more resistant to the pressures that once threatened to deform it. The process is called hardening, and it requires, without exception, the application of extreme heat. The empath has been through the heat. The process was not chosen, not invited, not deserved, but it happened. And the question that now matters is not whether it happened, it did, but what it produced. And what it produced in the empath who is willing to recognize it honestly rather than remain inside the narrative of pure damage is a quality of emotional and perceptive resilience that is genuinely extraordinary. This does not mean the empath is not wounded. They are. Real wounds require real healing, and the work of that healing is not something to be bypassed or minimized or performed rather than genuinely undertaken. But wounded and diminished are not the same thing. A person can carry real wounds and simultaneously carry real power. In fact, some of the most profound human power that exists is carried by people who are doing exactly that, moving through their healing while simultaneously discovering, sometimes with genuine surprise, that what they are capable of has not contracted in the aftermath of their most difficult experience. It has expanded. The narcissist tried to convince you that your gifts were the problem: too much feeling, too much depth, too much sensitivity, too much everything. They pathologized the very qualities that made you extraordinary because those qualities, fully expressed and properly directed, were the one thing they could not control. Your gifts were never the problem. They were always the threat. And now that you are free to aim them at your own life, there is nothing they cannot illuminate. We have now traced the arc of this comeback through its most intimate and personal dimensions the moment it began, the pain that forged it, the identity that is being reclaimed, the gifts that not only survived but deepened through the encounter. And now we arrive at something that is, in many ways, the most practical and immediately tangible outcome of everything the empath has been through. Something that will shape every relationship, every interaction, every decision they make going forward in ways that are concrete and real and life-changing. We are talking about boundaries, but not the kind of boundaries that get discussed in self-help conversations as though they are simply a matter of learning to say no more often. We are talking about something categorically different, something that cannot be taught in a workshop or acquired from a book or developed through intellectual understanding alone. We are talking about boundaries that were born in the fire. Let us be precise about what this means and why it matters. There are two fundamentally different kinds of boundaries that a person can carry. The first kind is theoretical, constructed from advice received, from observation of other people's healthy relationships, from an intellectual understanding of where one's limits should be. These boundaries are real, and they are valuable, and they represent genuine progress in a person's psychological development. But they have a limitation that becomes apparent the moment they are genuinely tested. Because a boundary that has only ever existed in theory, that has never been pressed against by someone who is genuinely determined to violate it, that has never had to hold under the specific and sophisticated pressure that a narcissist applies, that boundary does not yet know its own strength, and neither does the person carrying it. The second kind of boundary is visceral. It is not constructed from advice or observation or intellectual framework. It is carved slowly, painfully, through direct lived experience of exactly what happens when boundaries are absent, through the experience of having extended trust that was systematically exploited, through the experience of having expressed vulnerability that was cataloged and weaponized, through the experience of having offered forgiveness that was received not as grace but as permission to repeat the behavior, through the experience of having stayed long past the point where every internal signal was screaming to leave because the theoretical understanding of self-respect had not yet been reinforced by the visceral knowledge of what its absence actually costs. The empath has that knowledge now, not as a concept, as a lived, embodied, cellular-level understanding that will never fully leave them. And that understanding is the foundation of a quality of boundary setting that is simply not available to someone who has not been through what they have been through. This is one of the most significant and least acknowledged gifts that emerges from the narcissistic experience for the empath who does the genuine work of recovery. Because what most people do not understand about boundaries is that their real function is not defensive. Yes, they keep harmful things out. But more fundamentally, boundaries are the architecture of identity. They are the structure that defines where you end and where another person begins. They are what makes genuine intimacy possible, because genuine intimacy, paradoxically, requires the presence of clear boundaries rather than the absence of them. You cannot truly meet another person in the space between you if there is no defined space between you. You can only merge. And merging, as the empath now understands from direct experience, is not intimacy. It is consumption. The empath who has survived a narcissistic relationship understands this distinction in a way that permanently changes how they enter and inhabit every future relationship. They know now what it feels like when someone is systematically working to dissolve the boundary between their identity and yours. They recognize the early signs, the subtle pressure to accommodate, the gradual expansion of what is expected, the slow erosion of the empath's separate preferences and instincts and needs in favor of an ever-expanding orbit around the narcissists. They feel it earlier, name it more quickly, and respond to it with a decisiveness that was simply not available to them before. There is also something important to understand about how the empath's new boundaries will feel to the people around them, particularly in the early stages of recovery, when the boundaries are being consciously rebuilt and consciously expressed for perhaps the first time. They will feel unfamiliar. They will feel, to the empath themselves, almost aggressive in their clarity, because the empath is accustomed to a version of themselves that accommodated, that softened, that found ways to make their needs smaller so that someone else's comfort could be larger. A boundary that is simply clear and simply firm will feel, by contrast, like a wall. It is not a wall. It is a definition, and there is an enormous difference between the two. A wall keeps everything out: connection as well as harm, intimacy as well as exploitation. A boundary keeps harm out while keeping the door open for everything genuine. The empath's new boundaries are not a closing. They are a discernment. They are the empath's hard-won ability to distinguish between the person who approaches them with authentic intention and the person who approaches them with an agenda, and to respond differently to each. This discernment is not coldness. It is not the abandonment of the empath's essential warmth and openness and extraordinary capacity for connection. It is the protection of those qualities. It is the empath finally understanding that their gifts are not infinite in their availability, that they are precious, and that precious things require guardianship. The narcissist spent the entire relationship treating your boundaries as obstacles to be overcome, as inconveniences to be managed, as evidence of your inadequacy rather than expressions of your worth. You know now, with a certainty that no one can argue you out of, that your boundaries were never the obstacle. They were always the standard. And anyone worthy of you will not just respect that standard. They will be grateful for it. We have been building towards something throughout this entire conversation. Each point, we have covered the quiet beginning of the comeback, the pain reframed as preparation, the identity being reclaimed, the gifts deepening rather than diminishing, the boundaries born from direct experience rather than theory. All of it has been circling around a central truth that we now need to name directly. Becca. Use everything we have discussed so far has been about what the empath survived, what they recovered, what they reclaimed. And all of that matters enormously. But now we need to talk about what comes next. What the empath does with everything they have recovered, where all of that reclaimed energy, all of that deepened wisdom, all of that hard-won psychological sophistication actually goes when it is no longer being consumed by the project of surviving someone else's dysfunction. We need to talk about power, specifically the empath discovering, perhaps for the first time in their adult life, the full and undiluted experience of their own. Because here is what most people fundamentally misunderstand about the empath's power. They tend to see it through the lens of sensitivity, as though the empath's greatest capacity is their ability to feel deeply, to absorb emotional information, to extend compassion and understanding in ways that most people cannot. And those things are real, and they are significant. But they are not the whole picture. They are, in fact, only the most visible surface of something that runs considerably deeper and operates with considerably more force than the word sensitivity typically implies. The empath's true power is generative. It is not simply receptive. It does not merely absorb and reflect and respond to what is already present in an emotional environment. It actively shapes that environment. The fully expressed empath changes the emotional atmosphere of every room they enter, every conversation they participate in, every relationship they genuinely inhabit. Not through force. Not through the kind of power that imposes itself through dominance or aggression or control, but through something more subtle and ultimately more durable through the quality of presence they bring, the depth of attention they offer, the authenticity of connection they create simply by showing up as fully and completely themselves. This power was present through, out of the narcissistic relationship. It never went away. But during that relationship, it was almost entirely redirected, funneled, with exhausting consistency, into the project of sustaining someone else. Every unit of the empath's generative capacity was being consumed by the work of managing the narcissist's emotional volatility, decoding their behavior, maintaining the connection, absorbing the damage, attempting the repair. The empath was operating at full power the entire time. They were simply operating it entirely in service of someone who was extracting it rather than reciprocating it. Think about what that means for what comes next. The empath's comeback is not the story of someone rebuilding from nothing. It is the story of someone redirecting everything. All of that capacity, every bit of the emotional intelligence, the perceptive depth, the generative presence, the extraordinary ability to connect and understand and create meaning is still fully present. It is simply, for the first time in a very long time, available. Available for the empath's own creative pursuits, their own professional ambitions, their own relationships with people who are genuinely capable of reciprocity, their own vision for what their life can be when it is no longer organized around someone else's dysfunction. And this redirection, when it happens when the empath begins to aim their full power at their own life rather than at the survival of a bulldog relationship that was consuming them, produces results that can feel almost startling in their speed and their magnitude. Because the capacity was always there. The engine was always running. It simply needed to be pointed in a direction that could actually sustain forward movement rather than perpetual, exhausting stasis. There is a psychological concept worth naming here, the concept of post-traumatic growth. It is distinct from simple recovery, distinct from the return to a prior baseline of functioning. Post-traumatic growth ascribes something more specific and more remarkable, the documented phenomenon whereby certain individuals, following experiences of significant psychological adversity, do not simply return to who they were before the adversity. They surpass it. They develop capacities, perspectives, and qualities of being that would not have been accessible to them without the specific challenge the adversity presented. The research on this is consistent and compelling. And the empath, with their extraordinary capacity for processing emotional experience and extracting meaning from it, is precisely the kind of person in whom post-traumatic growth tends to express itself most fully and most dramatically. This is not a guarantee. Post-traumatic growth is not automatic. It does not happen simply because suffering occurred. It happens because the person who suffered chooses deliberately, courageously, sometimes against the pull of grief and anger and exhaustion, to engage with their experience rather than simply endure it. To ask not just how do I survive this, but what does this experience make possible that was not possible before? To treat their own recovery not as a return to a previous state, but as the construction of something genuinely new. The empath who makes that choice, and it is a choice, available at every stage of the recovery process, will discover something that the narcissist spent the entire relationship trying to prevent them from discovering. That the power they were giving away was never ordinary. And now that it is finally theirs again, fully, completely, irrevocably theirs, there is nothing in their life it cannot transform.